The whisper of horsehair against seasoned oak was a sound I knew intimately, a comfort. My fingers, calloused and precise, coaxed the last of the grime from the intricate carving on the antique console table. A hairline crack, barely visible to the untrained eye, ran along the grain, a testament to time and careless handling. I reached for my smallest brush, its bristles finer than a spider's silk, and began the delicate application of filler, each stroke a meditation. This was my world, a universe of forgotten beauty and meticulous restoration. My workshop, a haven of order amidst a chaotic world, hummed with the quiet industry of my solitary life. Then the letter arrived. Thick, cream-colored paper, sealed with a crest I didn't recognize. It spoke of an inheritance, a distant relative I'd never met, and a property, a manor house, that was now mine. My life, neatly catalogued and carefully preserved, was about to be upended. The drive north was a descent into an older, wilder landscape. The asphalt roads eventually gave way to cracked tarmac, then to a winding track overgrown with brambles and gnarled oaks. The air grew heavier, cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight, once bright and insistent, became a hesitant dappling through a thick canopy of branches that seemed to knit themselves together, forming a tunnel. And then, it appeared. Not a grand reveal, but a slow, hulking emergence from behind a shroud of ancient, skeletal trees. The manor house. It wasn't merely old, it was ancient, like a sleeping leviathan dredged from the deepest parts of the sea. Stone walls, once proud and imposing, were now streaked with black mildew and green moss, like weeping scars. Windows, countless and dark, stared out like vacant eyes from beneath heavy, sagging eaves. Turrets, capped with crumbling slate, reached for a sky that seemed perpetually bruised above it. This wasn't just a house, it was a monument to neglect, a vast, decaying maw. I pulled my car to a halt in front of a pair of immense, wrought iron gates that had long ago rusted themselves into immobility. They were adorned with a coat of arms, partially obscured by lichen, depicting something predatory, a bird perhaps, with talons outstretched. Getting out, I breathed in the air, thick with the scent of wet earth, stagnant water, and something else, something indefinable, like old dust and forgotten lives. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant, mournful cry of an unseen bird. My boots crunched on gravel that was more weed than stone. The scale of the place was overwhelming, a project that would consume not just months, but years, perhaps a lifetime. A part of me, the meticulous restorer, felt a surge of professional challenge, a determination to bring this behemoth back from the brink. Another part, a quieter, more primal voice, urged caution. I pushed it inward, and the groan it emitted echoed through the cavernous entrance hall, a sound like a dying animal. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom from high, arched windows. Everywhere I looked, decay held court. Wallpaper peeled in languid strips, revealing layers of forgotten patterns beneath. Furniture, draped in ghostly white sheets, loomed like shrouded figures. I ran a hand over a dusty banister, the wood smooth beneath the grime, hinting at the craftsmanship buried beneath. This wasn't just neglect, it felt like abandonment, a deliberate turning away. My professional curiosity, my drive to understand the structure, the history, pulled me deeper. I noted architectural anomalies, strange alcoves, doors that seemed to lead nowhere. My exploration eventually led me to a narrow, unlit corridor tucked away behind what must have once been the servants' quarters. The walls were rough-hewn stone, unlike the plaster and paneling of the main house. The floor sloped downward slightly, and the passage narrowed, pressing in on me. I reached into my bag for my heavy-duty flashlight. They looked like cells. My breath hitched. This was not a pantry, not a wine cellar. My meticulous mind, accustomed to cataloging and understanding, struggled to reconcile this with the decaying grandeur of the manor. What kind of house had this? What history lay buried here, behind these doors, in this grim, forgotten passage? The determination that had brought me here, the desire to restore, now mingled with a growing, profound unease. This was more than just a house, it was a tomb, and I had just opened its first, forbidding door. The air in my lungs felt suddenly too thin, too cold. The chill that had settled deep in my bones persisted, even as I forced myself to turn away from the heavy oak door that sealed the passage. Logic dictated I couldn't tackle every mystery at once. I had a job to do. I retreated to what I designated my primary workspace, the old library. Dust motes danced in the sparse sunlight filtering through grimy windows, illuminating the pervasive decay. This was where I would begin, restoring a magnificent, but badly damaged, writing desk that stood forlorn in a corner, a testament to forgotten craftsmanship. Setting up my portable workbench, I laid out my tools with practiced precision: micro-chisels, solvent bottles, fine-grit sandpaper, a selection of brushes, and a magnifying lamp. The familiar scent of linseed oil and wood polish, usually so comforting, mingled with the musty odor of ancient paper and damp plaster, creating a peculiar, unsettling perfume. I began with the desk's top, carefully scraping away layers of grime and old varnish. The work was painstaking, requiring absolute focus, and for a time, it allowed me to push the manor's unsettling atmosphere to the periphery. The rhythmic scrape of my blade, the gentle hiss of sandpaper, these were my anchors in the vast, silent house. My hand met empty air. I frowned, certain I'd placed it just to my left, beside the solvent. I glanced around my immediate workspace. Nothing. A slight annoyance pricked at me. Had I put it back in its case without thinking? No, that wasn't like me. My system was rigid, efficient. I scanned the floor, then the tabletop, even checked my pockets. Finally, my gaze fell on the far end of the workbench, near the edge, almost obscured by a stack of old blueprints I'd brought in. There it was. Not where I'd left it. Not even close. Huh, I muttered, retrieving it. I dismissed it as a momentary lapse, a consequence of the new environment, the fatigue from my journey. My rational mind supplied the explanation: dust, an old house settling, my own overactive imagination. I returned to the desk, the incident already fading. But then, a new sound, distinct from the house's usual groans and creaks, seeped into the library. A faint, almost imperceptible thump. It sounded like it came from upstairs, directly overhead. I paused, chisel hovering, my breath held. Then, another thump, softer this time, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across a floor. My meticulous nature warred with a rising unease. Raccoons, I told myself. A squirrel. But the sounds were too deliberate, too heavy for small animals. And I'd thoroughly checked the attic and upper floors for any signs of wildlife during my initial survey. I put the chisel down, my hands suddenly feeling clammy. I listened intently, straining to hear over the rapid thump of my own pulse. Just the profound, ancient quiet of the manor. It wasn't a specific sensation of eyes, but a general prickling on my neck, a sense of being observed from unseen angles. The hair on my forearms stood on end. As I worked my way down the desk's front, cleaning the ornate carvings, my fingers brushed against something unusual. A small, almost invisible seam in the wood, not part of the original design. My restorer's instinct immediately recognized it as a hidden compartment. With a delicate tool, I carefully pried it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not jewelry or documents, but a single, peculiar item. Etched onto its surface, with an almost impossible precision, was a symbol I didn't recognize, a series of interlocking, irregular spirals that seemed to draw the eye inwards, a tiny, hypnotic vortex. It wasn't religious, wasn't heraldic. It felt older. Pre-language, almost. I turned the stone over, searching for any further markings, but found none. The symbol alone was enough to make my mind race. What did it mean? Who had carved it? And why hide it so meticulously? My gaze drifted from the stone, across the silent library, and for a terrifying second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway leading to the old death row corridor marked for closure. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. Just the empty, yawning entrance to the forbidden passage. The faint dragging sound from upstairs seemed to echo in my memory, and the cold stone in my hand felt suddenly heavier, pulsing with an unseen energy. I was alone in this vast, decaying house, or was I? I felt utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable, as if every move I made was being watched, analyzed, anticipated. The air in my lungs felt suddenly too thin, too cold, prickling like fine needles with each shallow breath. My meticulous mind, accustomed to cataloging and understanding, struggled to reconcile this with the decaying grandeur of the manor I'd been so eager to restore. The question echoed in the unnatural stillness, a hollow sound against the damp, stone walls. The words, barely legible, seemed to claw at my vision, raising gooseflesh along my arms. The corridor itself was narrow, lower than I'd expected, forcing me to hunch slightly. The air here was heavy with the scent of stagnant water, mildew, and something else. Something metallic and ancient, like dried blood and rust. On either side, thick wooden doors, reinforced with iron straps, stood like sentinels of forgotten suffering. Each door bore a crude, hand-carved mark, a scratch, a symbol, a number. They were all tightly shut, some warped and swollen with moisture, others splintered as if something had tried to force its way out, or in. My gaze lingered on the raw, splintered wood of one door, imagining the force required to create such damage. My flashlight beam swept over the rough-hewn stone walls, searching for any anomaly. My restorer's eye, trained to spot the slightest inconsistency, noticed it almost immediately. Midway down the corridor, between two of the ominous wooden doors, the stonework shifted. It wasn't obvious, a casual glance would miss it. But I saw the faint hairline cracks, the slight difference in the mortar's texture, the almost imperceptible seam running vertically and horizontally, outlining a rectangular section of the wall. It was too neat, too deliberate, to be a natural settling crack. A hidden compartment. This was the kind of secret I usually relished, a puzzle to be solved, a piece of history to be brought back into the light. But here, in this suffocating space, it felt different. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a suppressed energy, a lingering echo of whatever had transpired within these walls. The seam was almost perfectly flush. There was no handle, no obvious latch. Nothing. The wall felt solid. I tried pushing, pulling, even pressing in various spots, but the section remained stubbornly inert. Frustration began to prickle. I retreated a few steps, examining the surrounding area. My light caught a small, almost invisible indentation in the stone directly above the hidden section, no larger than a thumbprint. Curiosity overriding caution, I pressed my thumb into it. A low, grinding groan rumbled through the corridor, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. Dust, thick and ancient, rained down from the ceiling. The rectangular section of the wall slowly, agonizingly, began to pivot inwards, revealing a sliver of utter blackness. The sound of stone on stone was deafening in the confined space, a mournful lament that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. When the hidden door finally swung fully open, it revealed not another passage, but a small, cramped alcove, barely wide. Enough for me to squeeze into. The air that rushed out was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. I shone my light inside. On a narrow, crumbling stone shelf, sat a single, leather-bound book, its cover warped and brittle. It looked ancient, almost primitive. Its leather was rough, dry to the touch, and crumbled slightly under my fingers as I carefully lifted it. The pages, yellowed and fragile, were filled with spidery, illegible script, written in what looked like faded ink. It wasn't English, nor any language I immediately recognized. There were also crude, disturbing illustrations, stick figures with exaggerated, suffering faces, strange symbols, and repetitive patterns that seemed to pulse with a silent, malevolent energy. As I carefully turned a page, a single, loose sheet of parchment fluttered out, landing at my feet. It was different from the rest, written in a stark, bold hand, in a language I did recognize, albeit an archaic form of it. It takes what is given, and then it takes more. A memory for a breath, a name for a night. The manor remembers, but we forget. Forgotten faces, forgotten deeds, forgotten selves. The keeper's burden, the price of knowing. My gaze darted from the cryptic text to the unsettling wooden carving, then back to the book of symbols. I tried to focus, to make sense of the fragmented words, but a strange fog seemed to descend over my mind. I stared at the parchment, then at the wooden carving, then back at the parchment again. What was I doing here? Why was I holding this? The questions bloomed in my mind, sudden and disorienting. I knew I was in the manor, knew I was restoring it, knew I had just opened this hidden compartment. But for a fleeting, terrifying moment, the details blurred. The purpose, the why, felt distant, like a dream I was struggling to recall. I shook my head, a sharp, involuntary motion. Just stress, read, I muttered aloud, the sound swallowed by the corridor. Too much isolation, too much work. My meticulous nature demanded answers, but for a second, I couldn't even recall the exact moment I decided to explore this specific, grim passage. It was unsettling, a flicker of something profoundly wrong. I tightened my grip on the brittle book, a determined spark reigniting in my chest. This discovery, disturbing as it was, only deepened the mystery, and my resolve to unravel it. The cold dread from the previous night had solidified into a grim resolve. The symbols, the cryptic text, the unsettling carving, they were pieces of a puzzle I had to solve, no matter how much they chilled me. I spent the next morning in the manor's small, forgotten study, a room I'd initially dismissed as too cluttered, too heavy with the scent of decaying paper and dust. I pulled out every old book, every brittle ledger, every rolled-up map I could find. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and aged parchment, a scent that usually comforted me in my restoration work, but now felt cloying, suffocating. My initial search was methodical. I looked for anything unusual, any mention of the manor's name beyond property transfers, any hint of the symbols I'd seen. The first few hours yielded little beyond dry financial records and mundane household inventories. But then, tucked inside a leather-bound diary belonging to a long-dead housekeeper, I found a scribbled entry, "The master grows distant." A local newspaper clipping from 1887 detailed the unexplained disappearance of a young apprentice who had worked on the manor's grounds. Another, from the early 1900s, spoke of the previous owner, a reclusive industrialist, who had descended into a profound melancholia, speaking of unseen presences and the theft of his own thoughts. He'd eventually been found wandering the nearby woods, utterly disoriented, unable to recall his name or where he lived. As I sifted through these unsettling fragments, a new kind of frustration began to prick at me. I'd set aside a stack of notes, carefully categorized by date and theme. I'd even drawn a rudimentary timeline on a large sheet of butcher paper. I stood up to stretch, my back aching from hunching over the desk for hours, and when I turned back, the stack of notes was inexplicably disarrayed. Papers I'd placed on the left were now on the right, some face down, others mixed with unrelated documents. I distinctly remembered putting the clipping about the apprentice at the very top. Now it was buried beneath a tax receipt from 1922. Had I done that? Had I, in my exhaustion, simply forgotten? My mind felt suddenly sluggish, like trying to push through thick mud. It was a minor thing, easily dismissed as fatigue, but it unsettled me deeply. Nothing. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a manifestation of my tired mind. But the sense of being watched, of something else in the room with me, lingered. I pushed through the growing unease, driven by the need to understand. The cousin expressed concern over the manor's unwholesome influence and mentioned a peculiar marking found on the industrialist's personal effects after his mental collapse, a description that eerily matched the symbol from the Book of Symbols. And then, a breakthrough. Much older owner for unspecified confinement related to unorthodox methods of memory extraction. The symbol, the same one I'd found, was crudely sketched in the margin next to this grim description. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The symbol wasn't just decorative, it was a mark, a signature, a warning. And the manor's history wasn't just one of odd occurrences, it was a repeating pattern of disappearances and madness, all linked by this insidious mark and, now, this horrifying mention of memory extraction tied to a place of confinement. That night, the nightmares came with a new, terrifying intensity. I was in a vast, echoing space, like an enormous, empty library, but the shelves held no books, only rows upon rows of empty, glass jars. My reflection stared back from each one, but it wasn't my reflection. It was a stranger's face, then another, then a blurred, shifting visage that was neither mine nor anyone I knew. I sat up in bed, trembling. My hands shook as I ran them over my face, trying to ground myself, to reassure myself that I was Reed, the restorer, in my manor. The manor wasn't just revealing its secrets, it was actively trying to dismantle my mind, piece by terrifying piece. I spent the next morning in the manor's small, forgotten study, a room I'd initially dismissed as a dusty antechamber. Sunlight, filtered through grime-streaked panes, caught motes dancing in the stagnant air, illuminating stacks of brittle ledgers and forgotten correspondence. It was a chore to even breathe in there, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. My fingers, calloused from years of delicate work, traced the spines of books I'd never bothered to open. It was a crude, hand-drawn map of the manor's lower levels, clearly ancient, its edges frayed like old lace. My eyes scanned the familiar outlines of the cellar, the wine stores, and then snagged on a section I'd never seen, never even suspected. What could such a place be doing beneath a supposedly grand estate? My resolve, however, burned hotter than my fear. This was a lead, a direct path to the heart of the creeping wrongness. I navigated the familiar, creaking stairs down to the cellars, the air growing heavier with each step. Past the rows of empty wine racks, past the vast, echoing space where I'd planned to store my larger restoration projects, the map indicated a hidden passage. I found it behind a crumbling stone wall, masked by decades of accumulated dust and cobwebs. I flicked on my heavy-duty lantern, its beam cutting a stark path through the gloom. The tunnel was short, leading to another, heavier door, this one made of thick, riveted steel. On its surface, the same looping symbol from the map had been etched, deep and deliberate, almost carved into the metal itself. These were smaller, more like alcoves, each sealed by a heavy, grimy steel grate that looked like it hadn't moved in a century. The space hummed with an almost imperceptible vibration, a low thrum that seemed to resonate not in my ears, but in my very bones. I took a step, then another, my boots scuffing against loose grit. Not a sound from the air, but a thought, forming in the back of my mind. You don't belong here. My head snapped up, scanning the empty corridor. Nothing. Just the peeling paint, the damp, and the overwhelming sense of immense, suffocating weight. You don't belong anywhere. The voice, if it was a voice, was not external. It was internal, yet alien, a parasitic thought worming its way into my consciousness. My name. Reed. I am Reed. An antique restorer. I live in this manor. A chill, not from the cold air, but from within, spread through me. The texture was jarringly real, yet my mind felt like it was fracturing. Who is Reed? What is Reed? A collection of faded memories, easily rearranged. Suddenly, the corridor seemed to stretch, the far end receding into an impossible distance. The cells on either side blurred, their grates twisting into grotesque, snarling faces. A wave of nausea washed over me. I saw myself, yes, hunched over a delicate mahogany desk, painstakingly sanding away years of neglect. But then, the image flickered, distorted. Was that my hand, or a stranger's? Was that my workshop, or a cramped, unfamiliar room with bars on the windows? Your past is not your own. Your present is a lie. Your future is ours. The words were deafening now, though no sound escaped my lips. My chest tightened, my lungs burning. I felt a profound, terrifying urge to scream, but my throat was locked. My hands flew to my head, clawing at my temples as if to physically tear the thoughts out. I stumbled backwards, away from the grates, away from the suffocating presence that was the very air of this corridor. The floor seemed to tilt, and the walls pulsed with a faint, sickening light that wasn't from my lantern. Memories, vivid and detailed, flashed through my mind, memories of a childhood I didn't recognize, of a different family, a different name. I saw myself, a different self, trapped behind those very grates, staring out with vacant eyes. No, I choked out, the word barely a rasp.
My name is Reed. I remember. The grandfather clock. The intricate carvings. Had I made them, or had I merely restored them? Or had I simply imagined them? My sense of self, that bedrock of who I was crumbling, dissolving into a million fractured pieces. I was losing myself, here, in this forgotten place, and the entity was laughing, not with a sound, but with the terrifying certainty of absolute victory. With a primal surge of adrenaline, I turned and stumbled back towards the steel door, the echoes of manufactured memories chasing my heels, demanding I remember a life that wasn't mine. The silent roar in my head finally receded, leaving behind a hollow echo, a buzzing void where my thoughts used to be. My hands dropped from my temples, fingers trembling. What was that? What was that? The questions felt like pebbles thrown into a deep well, no splash, no sound, just a profound, unsettling silence. I needed to get out. Not just out of this room, but out of here. This house. It was a suffocating, living thing, tightening its grip around me with every passing moment. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy. It was in my pocket, where it always was. I pulled it out, the cold glass a small comfort against my clammy palm. The screen was black. Not just off, but dead. No battery indicator, no response to the power button. Just a blank, lifeless rectangle. I pressed the button again, harder this time, then shook it, as if jostling the device would magically bring it to life. Nothing. My throat felt dry, sandpaper rough. Last night? This morning? Had I forgotten to plug it in? Or had the power in the house gone out at some point? No, the lights were on, casting their sickly yellow glow. This wasn't just a dead battery. This felt. No phone. I'll just leave. It sounded so simple. Just walk out the door. I turned, heading for the grand entrance hall, the logical way out. I pushed through the swing doors leading to the main hall, the heavy wood groaning in protest. Something stagnant. I squinted, trying to pierce the gloom that seemed to cling to the corners of the vast space. My boots echoed on the marble floor as I moved towards the imposing front door. It was a behemoth of oak, studded with tarnished iron. I twisted, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Right, I muttered, trying to sound calm, trying to rationalize. It's an old house. Old locks. Probably just stiff. I braced myself, put my full weight into the twist, and pulled. I tried pushing. Still nothing. The door was an immovable slab. I ran my hands over its surface, searching for a deadbolt, a hidden latch, anything. There was nothing but smooth, unyielding wood and iron. It was sealed. I turned to the tall, narrow windows flanking the door. They were beautiful, leaded panes, each diamond-shaped piece of glass reflecting a distorted image of my anxious face. They were painted shut, or perhaps just fused by years of neglect. I pressed my palm against the glass. It was thick, solid. Breaking it would be a monumental task, and the thought of the jagged shards, the cold wind rushing in, made me flinch. I backed away, my eyes darting around the hall. Trapped. I was trapped. No, I hissed, shaking my head. No, I'm not. There has to be another way.
I remembered the back entrance, near the old kitchens. It was less grand, more utilitarian. I turned, retracing my steps, moving faster now, a frantic urgency propelling me forward. The house seemed to shift around me, the familiar layout subtly altered. Was this the way to the kitchen? The corridor seemed longer, dimmer, a new door appearing where I didn't recall one. I pushed it open, hoping for the familiar scent of old spices and forgotten meals. Instead, a wave of stale, musty air, tinged with something sharp and metallic, hit me. I stepped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't the kitchen. It was a long, narrow passage, dimly lit by bare bulbs hanging precariously from the ceiling. They looked like something out of a forgotten prison. Death row. Here? In this manner? The words echoed the silent screams from earlier, the ones that had assaulted my mind. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. This wasn't just an old house, it was a tomb, a cage. And I was inside it. The house wasn't just keeping me in, it was showing me what it was. And what I might become. My breath caught in my throat. Death row. Here? In this manner? My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. I stared at the peeling paint, the crude letters, the chilling implication. This wasn't just an old house, this was something far more sinister. A cold draft snaked around my ankles, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang that wasn't rust, but something deeper, almost visceral. But I couldn't turn back. Not now. I had come too far, felt too much of this place's insidious influence. I needed answers, even if they shattered what little sanity I had left. I forced one foot forward, then the other, into the gloom. Or perhaps that was just my mind playing tricks, projecting the entity's nature onto the very atmosphere. The walls here were different. Not merely peeling plaster, but rough-hewn stone in places, smeared with what looked like dried mud or ancient grime. They swirled and intertwined, resembling twisted vines or grasping hands. Below them, scratched with a sharper instrument, were lines of text in a language I dimly recalled from an old restoration project involving ecclesiastical texts, an archaic form of Latin. I pulled out my phone, its weak beams slicing through the gloom, and began to painstakingly decipher the script. My fingers trembled slightly as I worked, tracing the letters on the screen, translating word by agonizing word. The first few lines spoke of the binding, of ancient earth given new hunger. It described the manor not just as a structure, but as a cage, a vessel. The text grew more frantic, the letters deepening with desperate pressure. It detailed how the manor's very foundations were laid over a primal nexus, a place where the veil between states of being was thin. The entity wasn't merely in the house, it was of the earth beneath it, awakened and given form by the suffering and isolation that had permeated this land long before the manor stood. Its origin was not of this world, not entirely, but a forgotten, malevolent aspect of the earth itself, drawn to the echoes of human pain. My blood felt like ice in my veins. This wasn't a ghost, it was something ancient, elemental. I pressed on, the phone's light jumping across the grim details of the corridor. I passed what must have been cells, their heavy wooden doors long rotted away, leaving gaping maw-like openings. In one of these cells, amidst the debris, I found a small, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. This wasn't a formal record, but a personal account, written in a spidery, desperate hand. The journal belonged to a former keeper of the manor, a man tasked with overseeing this very corridor generations ago. He wrote of the consumption, of the slow emptying. The entity, he explained, fed not on flesh, but on the very essence of personhood. It was a psychic parasite, drawing sustenance from memories, from identity, from the unique tapestry that made each individual. The process was slow, insidious. First, small memories would vanish, a name, a childhood event, the face of a loved one. The horror of it was not death, but a living erasure. The screams I'd heard, the ones that had clotted my mind, weren't just echoes of pain, they were the sound of identities being shredded, of souls being consumed. He described the purpose of this death row not as a place for execution, but for the careful, prolonged siphoning of these essences. The victims, he wrote, were kept isolated, their minds fertile ground for the entity's insidious hunger. The longer they were here, the more complete the consumption. This explained the crude death row inscription. It wasn't a place for death, but a place of death, where identity died. The final pages of the journal were almost illegible, scrawled with a shaking hand, the ink blurring as if the writer's own memories were already fading. But one passage stood out, stark and terrifying. It demands a sacrifice. Not of blood, but of self. A complete surrender. Only then does the hunger abate, for a time. To bind it, to starve it, one must offer oneself, utterly. To become the vessel, the memory, the identity it craves, but never fully consumes, thereby trapping it within an endless feast. A guardian. A living tomb. The ultimate cost wasn't just losing my memories, it was becoming the eternal prison for this thing, sacrificing my entire self, my existence, to contain it. To become the very thing it fed on, endlessly, without release. It spoke my name, Reed, but stretched and distorted, as if trying out the taste of it. It was already working on me, testing its grip. The truth was revealed, horrifying and absolute. The sacrifice demanded was everything. And it was coming for me. The whisper, cold and dry like dust stirred in an ancient crypt, seemed to brush against the very fabric of my thoughts. Becoming the prison. Not just dying, not just losing my memories, but existing as an empty shell, an endless wellspring for that thing to draw from. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, staggering me back against the damp stone of the cellar wall. My chest felt hollowed out, a cavern where my heart used to beat with purpose. Now, it just thrummed with a frantic, desperate rhythm. What was my mother's maiden name? Jenkins, I thought. Or was it Johnson? A flicker of panic, hot and sharp, pierced through the dull ache in my skull. I knew it. I did know it. Jenkins. Yes. But the hesitation, the momentary blankness, was a terrifying testament to its insidious work. It wasn't just taking fragments, it was dissolving the adhesive that held my identity together. This wasn't just about saving myself anymore, if myself even remained in any meaningful sense. This was about stopping it from spreading, from consuming everything I had ever known, everything this house represented. A plan, bleak and terrifying, began to coalesce in the shattered remnants of my logic. A door that led to a section of the manor I'd been avoiding, a place that even the construction workers had refused to touch. They had simply boarded it up, muttering about permits and structural integrity, but I'd seen the fear in their eyes. Pushing through the cobwebs and the thick, musty air, I found myself in a narrow, windowless corridor, the air heavy and still. And etched into the stone above each of the heavy, riveted doors lining the hall were numbers, faded but still legible. A place where lives ended, and memories were snuffed out. This was my discovery. Not a hidden scroll, not a cryptic message, but the very architecture of despair. Each cell, a tiny tomb, designed to strip away identity, to reduce a life to a number, to await an inevitable, brutal end. It was perfect. My plan, a desperate gamble, began to solidify. I would lure it here, into one of these cells. I would strip myself bare, not of clothing, but of everything it desired. I would try to empty my mind, to sever the connections to my past, to my name, to my work, to my very essence, to become as blank and featureless as these stone walls. I would make myself the ultimate, unsatisfying meal. The entity sought vibrancy, the rich tapestry of a lived life, the nuanced patterns of identity. It would be trapped, feeding endlessly on an emptiness that could never be filled, a prison of its own making. The immense personal sacrifice was clear. I would become a ghost in my own body, an echo, a presence without a past. I might lose the ability to speak, to recognize faces, to even remember what I was trying to accomplish. I pushed open the door to one of the cells, the hinges groaning in protest, a sound like a dying sigh. The interior was a small, square box, utterly bare save for a rusted iron ring bolted to the far wall. I imagined the despair that must have soaked into these stones, the final, desolate thoughts of countless souls. This was where I would make my stand. This was where Reed would cease to be. My hand trembled as I reached out, tracing the rough, cold stone of the cell wall. It was a terrifying prospect, this self-annihilation, this deliberate unmaking. But what was the alternative? To slowly, agonizingly, become its puppet, its eternal food source? No. This was my choice. My last, desperate act of defiance. Becoming the prison. A living, breathing, but utterly vacant monument to its insatiable hunger. The thought curdled in my gut, a bitter taste of ultimate defeat. But then, a flicker. A tiny, defiant spark in the abyss of my eroding mind. It wanted my memories, my identity. So I would give it nothing. Or rather, I would give it something it couldn't consume. My plan, cobbled together from fragmented insights and desperate guesses, was a gamble. A last-ditch effort to reclaim myself, or at least, to deny it the final victory. I had to find the anchor, the very first thread it had plucked, and sever it. Or, perhaps, reinforce it so strongly that it would become a barrier, not a bridge. I closed my eyes, focusing not on the encroaching darkness. It was the genesis of everything I was, everything I loved, everything that made me read. When I opened my eyes, the study was gone. Something sterile and yet putrid, like old disinfectant failing to mask decay. My breath plumed in front of me. It stretched before me, an endless tunnel of peeling, institutional green paint and rough, gray concrete. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of unseen moisture somewhere in the distance and a faint, mournful groan that seemed to emanate from the very walls. One of many. All the same. All mine. It was a gauntlet thrown. Each cell door I passed was identical, yet I felt a primal urge to peer through the non-existent bars, to see the faces of those it had consumed before me. I fought the urge, forcing my gaze forward. This wasn't about them, it was about me. The entity's attack began subtly, a blurring at the edges of my vision. The corridor rippled, and for a terrifying moment, the face of my grandfather, once so clear, warped into a leering, toothless mask.
My stomach churned. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms. Not real.
My own name, Reed, was drawn out, distorted into a mocking lament. Then came the memories, not mine, but implanted, false narratives designed to erode my core. I saw myself as a child, but instead of the warm workshop, I was alone, neglected, my small hands fumbling with meaningless fragments. I saw myself as an adult, but my craft was pointless, my restorations crumbling to dust even as I worked.
Lies.
I shouted, the word tearing from my throat, raw and defiant. I focused harder on the linseed oil, the wood grain, the precise angle of the chisel. I built that memory in my mind, brick by painstaking brick, shoring up its foundations against the entity's assault. I wasn't just remembering, I was restoring it, applying the same meticulous care I would to a priceless antiquity. I saw the light from the dusty window, felt the cool metal of the tool, smelled the specific, comforting aroma of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. The corridor seemed to recoil.
Lost. Forgotten. It projected an image of myself, withered and ancient, sitting blank-faced in a desolate room, utterly devoid of thought or purpose. This was the reveal. The true horror wasn't just death, but the eternal, conscious oblivion it inflicted on its victims, turning them into silent, living batteries. But seeing it, truly seeing the ultimate fate it planned for me, ignited a furious, desperate resolve. I wouldn't be that. I wouldn't be one of the nameless, forgotten echoes.
My plan wasn't just to remember, it was to fight for the right to remember.
I restore. I create. I remember.
I began to walk again, blindly, but with purpose.
My hands scraped against the wall, guiding me.
I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I was moving away from the entity's twisted vision, towards the core of myself. With every step, I recited my name, my purpose, my defining memories. The feel of polished mahogany, the intricate carving of a rococo chair, the gleam of restored silver.
Each detail was a weapon, a shield.
But I held on, clinging to the fragments of my identity like a shipwrecked sailor to a piece of driftwood. This was the battle for self, and I would not surrender.
Not now. Not ever. I restore antiques. My hands.
They shaped wood, polished metal. My second is the feel of a cold, smooth porcelain doll in my childhood home, its painted eyes always watching.
My mother's laughter.
The biting sting of the sea wind on the cliffs near my old university. My apartment, the quiet hum of the dehumidifier, the scent of solvents and old paper. My purpose is to mend, to piece together what time has broken. The entity's grip, which had been an icy claw twisting in the very marrow of my being, did not release with a sudden snap. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing slide, like thick mud peeling from a boot. The vibrant, horrifying delusions, the kaleidoscope of borrowed lives and manufactured fears, flickered, wavered, then began to recede. They didn't vanish completely, rather, they thinned, becoming translucent, like a veil pulled back to reveal something equally grim, but tangibly real. The oppressive weight on my chest lessened, replaced by a hollow ache. My lungs burned, demanding air I hadn't realized I was holding. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth, rust, and something else. Something metallic and stale, like old, dried blood. My eyes, still blurry from the entity's assault, struggled to focus. I pushed myself up, my limbs screaming in protest. Every muscle felt like waterlogged rope, refusing to obey. My hands, when I finally saw them, were trembling violently, smeared with grime and a fine, reddish dust. This wasn't the grand hall of the manor, nor any room I recognized. I was in a narrow, windowless corridor, the walls a patchwork of peeling gray paint and crumbling plaster. To my left, a series of heavy, rusted iron doors lined the wall, each with a small, barred slit at eye level. Above each door, crudely painted numbers, faded but still legible, marked individual cells. How I had arrived here, I couldn't say. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that pulsed behind my eyes. What had just happened? I had been fighting for my name. Fighting for my memories, but what memories? I closed my eyes, trying to conjure them, to grasp at the specifics. The linseed oil. Yes. The porcelain doll. A sound, a feeling, but the image of her face. It wavered, indistinct, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The cliffs near my university. I could feel the wind, hear the gulls, but the name of the university, the subject I studied. They slipped away, like water through cupped hands. My purpose. I was Reed, an antique restorer. I had inherited a house. A big, old house. With secrets. Yes, that much I knew. But the specific details of the restoration, the intricate carvings I'd painstakingly repaired, the hidden panels I'd discovered. They were hazy, like dreams half forgotten upon waking. I ran a hand over my face, the rough texture of my unshaven cheek a small, grounding sensation. My fingers brushed against something crusty near my temple. I pulled my hand away to see a smear of dried blood. I didn't remember being hurt. The entity. It had wanted my memories, my identity. And I had fought it. I had won. But at what cost? It had retreated, yes, but it hadn't left me whole. It had carved pieces out of me, leaving jagged, empty spaces in their wake. My legs wobbled, threatening to give out. My gaze swept over the numbered doors, the rusty bars. A fitting tomb for what I felt had been stripped from me. I shuddered. The scent of sawdust, rich and dry, filled my small, rented workshop. It was miles from the manor, a world away. I'd chosen this place for its anonymity, for the reassuring hum of distant city traffic that drowned out the whispers, or what I thought were whispers. My hands, once so certain, moved over a scarred walnut desk, sanding away decades of neglect. This was my trade, my life. I was Reed. I restored antiques. I was rebuilding. Each day, I'd wake in my modest apartment, make coffee, come here. I'd touch familiar wood grains, clean tarnished brass, the simple, repetitive motions of balm to the frayed edges of my mind. The manor was a nightmare, a closed chapter. I'd left it empty, sealed, a tomb for whatever festered within its walls. I'd won. I'd walked away. But the silence in the workshop, when the sander finally wore down, felt too deep. My memories, for instance. They were fragmented. I remembered the smell of linseed oil in my grandfather's workshop, vividly. My mother's laughter. The biting sting of a splinter. But the connections between these moments, the tapestry of a life, felt stretched thin, like old lace about to tear. Sometimes, I'd be working, completely immersed, and then I'd blink, and a minute would be gone or an hour. I'd find myself holding a tool I didn't remember picking up, having completed a step I didn't recall starting. Just fatigue, I'd rationalize. Stress. The aftershocks of a terrible ordeal. A commission came in, a strange one. A city development project. They were demolishing an old, forgotten correctional facility, and wanted me to salvage any architectural details of historical merit before the wrecking ball moved in. It sounded morbid, but the pay was good, and I needed the work. Needed the distraction. They're tearing it down by end of week. The words echoed in the vast, empty space. Bare cells lined either side, their heavy steel doors either. Ripped off or hanging precariously from single hinges. It pressed in on me, like a physical weight. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing. My eyes scanned for anything worth saving, a unique vent cover, a stylized grate, maybe even an old, intricately carved piece of a warden's office door, long since gone. And then I saw it. Scratched into the wall, faint but undeniable, was a single, crudely drawn symbol. A spiral. The same twisted, insidious spiral that had adorned the manor's hidden chambers, the symbol of the entity that fed on memories. My breath hitched. No, I told myself. Coincidence. A common shape. My mind playing tricks. I tried to focus. My job. I ran my hand over the scarred concrete again, trying to feel the texture, to ground myself. But as my fingers traced the rough surface, a strange sensation bloomed in my mind. Not a memory, but a feeling. A profound sense of understanding. Of belonging. I looked at the spiral again. It didn't feel like a warning anymore. My gaze drifted to the cell opposite. I peered inside. But then, my eyes caught on something else, further down the corridor. On the floor, just outside another cell, was a small, porcelain doll. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, insistent drum. It was identical to the one from my childhood home. Its painted eyes stared up at me, vacant and knowing. I knelt, my knees cracking on the cold floor. My fingers traced the delicate cracks in its painted face. And as I held it, a memory, sharp and vivid, surged through me. Not my memory, not exactly. It was the memory of a condemned man, sitting alone in his cell, meticulously carving a small wooden bird from a sliver of smuggled wood. The feel of the grain beneath his thumb, the desperate focus, the fleeting sense of peace in the face of oblivion. I stood up slowly, the doll heavy in my hand. The memory wasn't mine, but I felt it. I understood it. It was as if I had lived it. The lines blurred. My name is Reed. I restore antiques. My hands. They shaped wood, polished metal. The desperate hope of a man carving a bird. The crushing weight of finality in a concrete cell. The entity hadn't just taken my memories. It had given me others. It had woven them into the fabric of my being, replaced the missing threads with strands from countless forgotten lives. My victory wasn't my escape, it was the entity's ultimate triumph. It hadn't needed the manor. It had simply needed me. I looked down at the doll, then at my hands. They were my asterisk hands, yes, but what they held now was more than just a doll.
It was a fragment of another's life, and it felt natural, comfortable, a new kind of belonging. I wasn't just Reed anymore.
I was a vessel, a living archive of 1,000 forgotten lives, each memory a new facet of my own twisted identity.
I was restoring echoes.
A part of me, the new me, was finally home.